So usually I won't get on topics because this is very opinionated and is basically my opinion. But I do want to talk about it because I think a lot of people kind of put certain collectors into bubbles, and I'm just gonna describe basically what I hate about certain collectors. So if you don't know, recently there was a Kid Icarus sealed video game found for the NES. Of course, the game came out in '87, and from what I remember, it sold just under 2 million. I don't know the exact, but I think that's about it. And so the game kind of is a classic, so to say. Now, a lot of people don't like it, a lot of people do like it. That's not what we're talking about here. We are talking about collecting. So, one of the things I want to talk about is the different types of collecting you can do in video games. And video game is kind of a broad term here because there's technically shelf collectors, which I'll get into. So there's three types I like to point out. There are the players, the people that collect rare games to play them. I feel like I fall under this category the most, though I will admit there are a few games that I just have that are sealed and will never be opened as long as I live, or whatever. But that's usually where I sit. If I buy a game, I'm more than likely gonna play it at some point, or I'm gonna just give it to someone who will play it. I hate the idea of having a game, especially if it's opened, left somewhere and no one plays it. It's such a waste of basically the game. Someone could be having fun and you're just like, nope, 60 or plus dollars. I don't like it. The second one is, of course, why I just said, the resellers slash non-players. They collect these games. They collect Chrono Triggers so they could put it on eBay and put the 200 plus dollar price tag on it, even though while it is a great game, and I'll never say it's not a great game, it's not worth 200 plus dollars. It's not that rare of a game. It's just well wanted, and resellers abuse it. And those are probably my least favorite collectors, especially since most resellers are literal pieces of crap and some of the worst people overall. Uh, and then there are the shelf collectors. I call these shelf collectors because they're not really sealed collectors. They're looking for stuff that goes on their shelf. And these I don't mind that much. I'm a little bit of that. I have a copy actually above me of the original Mega Man because I am a big Mega Man fan. I do have a Symphony of the Night, a few copies. One of them is sealed from, I don't even remember, but overall, like, I do have a few of those. I'm not saying I don't do it, but their main goal is to get something that goes on the shelf and it looks nice and it's a bragging rights basically. Now, I that was basically what I was just describing was the three types. Now, I want to get into why ultimately resellers are really bad for video games just in general. So, when it comes to video games, especially nowadays, if a game comes out, there are very few collectible parts about it besides the collector's editions, limited editions, Super Mega Ultra Lightning Edition, uh, maybe a comic book that came with it, the steel book, maybe soundtracks, stuff like that. There's always stuff that comes with it nowadays to make it collectible, but in reality, games are made millions upon millions of copies at a time that very rarely do they become collectible nowadays. Now, there are a few that do slip through the cracks that didn't sell well immediately, that are made as a joke but managed to become collectible. And maybe the physical copies were only printed in the thousands because the downloads was already sold in the millions. It's stuff like that that will change rarity. So that's with new games. Old games, they are very limited. We're talking from the difference of 5 million copies are going to be printed no matter what on this AAA title, even if it doesn't sell at all, to we're going to print maybe 100,000. And this is back during the AAA, in quote, titles. We're going to print 100,000 and we'll see how this goes. And even for lesser companies, they were like, we're going to print 500, 1,000, 10,000 sometimes. And that means some of these games are very limited. Now, most of them, there are more than 100,000 or whatever, because that's just a generic number that I pulled out. But they put these limits, and if they didn't sell, they didn't make more. Because obviously they weren't going to make money, they weren't going to waste materials, because video games cost more to produce back then. In materials, anyway. Nowadays, it's more of the work costing more, because they have more team members, whatever. But, so the production for a Nintendo cartridge, for example, for the NES, is way more than a disc is. A disc is not that expensive. The plastic used on an NES, the boards, all that stuff, and that's what makes it kind of hold its value a little bit more. A disc that goes down 10 years from now will more than likely be worth less than the Nintendo cartridge. And so it comes down to the classics holding their value because it takes a little bit more of production. Now, and they're also very limited, as I was explaining. So when you get down to resellers being really bad, you're taking a limited market. So let's say this game was made 10,000 copies back in 89. Let's just say that. All right. And the game is average. It's an average game, not very standoutish. That's why it didn't sell well, blah, 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 so on and so forth. We get to here, and people are looking to get a complete collection. And that game is on the list. There's only 10,000 of them, for instance. I know it's a very low number, but just work with me. And so you have resellers that look at it, and they stare at it, and they're like, people will want this. I found it at a swap meet. I found it at a garage sale. I found it in a auction. I found it for very cheap. They're going to do a guesstimate, in quote, if there is no previous posting on it, and they will put what they think the cartridge is worth. So in the case of it being a very rare game, they will of course put hundreds, thousands of dollars. If there is already a kind of precedent already posted for them, they'll copy that. So in the case of finding a cartridge for $5 that's worth $200, they do that. They will put it for the max eBay price. When people say eBay price, it's usually the max price you're going to find. And which is kind of ridiculous that some people ask for eBay prices at a garage sale, but that's another point entirely. So what they're doing with that is they are getting money. And you know what? You can't really fault them for that. It's a tough world out there, whatever. But the biggest issue that this brings up is it lowers the amount of people that can impact the scene. Because if someone is trying to get the NES collection to play them, to maybe be inspired by them, or to even just put them in a museum for showcasing history, to maybe play a nostalgic game with their kids, they're going to look at the price and be like, no, I'm not going to do it. And they're going to jump out the scene, and then you have the top 1% of the video game scene that's like, $200, I have that in my shoelace because whatever. And they throw it at it, and they have it on their shelf, and they don't play it. And then it becomes a cycle where they might resell it, they might keep it on their shelf, and very rarely do those games get played. And ultimately, the biggest issue is that no one new is entering the scene. It's basically like a fenced-in yard, and it's electrified. And there's a guy at the gate that's like $5 to get in. This is a random yard. You have no idea what's in here. Hand me $5 to get in. And no one's going to do that unless they really want to be in that yard for some reason, to take a chance that maybe there's something good. And in the case of like Chrono Trigger, it's a great game. Is it worth $200? Fuck no. It's not worth that amount. Because ultimately, that's a lot of money to spend on a game that isn't that long. Chrono Trigger is a great game, but you're not getting your money's worth in that case. And when you get down to it, resellers just block these people from being able to enter for free or even for cheap and maybe spread information about it. We learn information about video games all the time, it becomes a part of history. And ultimately, what if a kid goes down the line and uses video games to inspire him for him to make video games, or maybe to make an invention? All these things, they are blocked out because of resellers electrifying the fence and charging admission. Going back to my analogy, but I'm not gonna say they're the worst part of it. Actually, I am. They are the worst part. I'm not gonna say they're the only part. There are problems with players too. A lot of the times they don't fully appreciate how much a game is worth. Uh, though nowadays that's becoming a very rare thing. And also, a lot of players don't like to share, which I've met quite a few. I'm actually friends with a couple of them, and they are pretty stingy on that regard. But there are problems with, of course, shelf collectors. I mean, that game is never going to be used. It's sealed. Hopefully it's never used, because then it's just like you threw $9,000 down the drain for an $8 game, because plastic is apparently worth so much. But ultimately, this was kind of just a rant on resellers and video game collecting. I know my title for this one, I guess, but when it comes down to the most recent Kid Icarus copy that was sold, going back to that, being a sealed copy didn't really affect me. I didn't really care. Kid Icarus is not a game that I would ever, like, if I seen a sealed copy in the wild somehow and I got it for very cheap, I'd probably put it at, like, I'd probably give it to someone and be like, you a big fan of this? Here you go. Unless I really needed the money. That's the type of, like, video game player I am. I'm willing to share, and that's always been my case with it. But unless I needed the money, I would more than likely give it to a diehard fan or a museum. A museum, just to show other people what game packaging was back then, or to show some box art. I know they have a lot of digital box art, but physical box art is needed too. And I don't know, it's just a topic I felt like talking about. So I think I'm gonna end it with resellers suck. Video game players rock, because I'm a part of that, and sealed people are alright. Though they usually come from coin collecting and toy collecting, because toys are always sealed, and yeah. But that's mostly where they come from. But overall, I think I'm about done here. I'll see you guys next time for whatever random topic hits my fancy or brain, whatever. So, till then.